So I'll do a couple of acknowledgements to start out. I usually don't do a territorial acknowledgement, not because I don't think they're important, but because sometimes it can just be window dressing. And in presentations, not doing, for me anyway, not doing an acknowledgement when I know it's kind of expected makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that kind of reminds me that I need to, back that up with action rather than just saying the words. But considering the government of New Brunswick's recent position on territorial acknowledgements, I think I will acknowledge that I am sitting on unsurrendered and unceded Awitgati territory. There were peace and friendship treaties signed, when settlers came. And those treaties, people agreed to share the land and cooperate. And I think a lot of Indigenous people right now feel like the non-Indigenous people are not kind of living up to those peace and friendship treaties. And, that's what the court case stems from with the Indigenous communities, hoping to get some of that crown land back from the government, and what that memo from the government also stemmed from. And I believe that Horizon chose not to distribute that directive to its employees, which I think is great. I'd like to acknowledge my privilege. I didn't used to feel like I came from a real privileged background. My dad was a used car salesman his whole life. My mom was an admin person or a stay-at-home mom. But I always had clothes to wear. I almost always had enough food to eat. I had two parents that are still together and they're visiting me from Newfoundland right now. I had two full sets of grandparents that I got to know growing up. And, in this work that I'm doing, that's really a huge privilege to have those things in my life, because so many people don't. It's important that we all acknowledge that if we want to work with Indigenous people and communities, or if we want to work outside of our own comfort zone or cultural background. And I attended an interesting presentation recently with Crown Attorney in Nova Scotia, Josie McKinney. She's a Mi'kmaq and Awitgati woman, and she works in human trafficking, where she's leading or part of a human trafficking initiative in Nova Scotia. And she said another acknowledgement that's really important to make, but difficult for healthcare providers, is that racism and discrimination exist in our healthcare system, in our education system, our justice systems. And, we can't start to make that better unless we acknowledge that it's happening. But luckily, there are a lot of really great people that I've worked with since coming here that, are really committed to addressing that. So, I'd like to just acknowledge. And then the New Brunswick Health Research Foundation, Canadian Nursing Foundation, CIHR, and the nursing faculty all provided funding to support this chair position that I received a couple of years ago. So important to acknowledge that as well. So the chair position, I've got 4 kind of core objectives. The first one is really to support community capacity development in research and program development. The second one is to hopefully push the knowledge dial on our understanding of Indigenous healing practices and helping practices, so that we might incorporate those into our education and health systems. Partnerships are extremely important. And then also, I guess my focus, based on the input that I've gotten from community partners, is that what's needed right now in terms of research and scholarship is to apply that lens to program development and evaluating programs to provide data that organizations can use to strengthen those programs and to demonstrate the outcome and impact to funders. So that's kind of where the intersection between my capacity or capabilities intersected with their needs at the point when this chair was conceived. And I work with a strong team of advisors, staff, research assistants, students, and very diverse as well, which has been a pleasure, because it's important, I think, that we challenge our preconceptions and unconscious bias, and it's hard to do that if we surround ourselves with people who are just like us. And I just want to talk for a second about this picture on the screen here. This is a not a great picture of an amazing painting that one of my students did a couple of years ago. And it's hung up inside our building, our nursing building here on campus. So what you can't really see is that the names of all the residential schools in Canada are written on the top and bottom or outside of the circle. And then after she did the painting, she tore the painting from, you can see where it's torn, to represent the torn relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the province or in the country. And then she took twine made out of moose hide and began to repair that rip to represent the beginning of reconciliation or the repairing relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And this was done before the chair started, but essentially that's the work that I'm doing in this role. I'll talk briefly about my view on allyship, and not everybody necessarily would agree with this, or I'm sure there's lots of stuff in here that are missing. But in terms of the work that I do, it's always, and I can't call myself an ally. Like an ally is something that somebody else, like a label that somebody else gives you. And I do feel fairly confident that several of my closer partners would view me that way. But healthcare professionals, I don't know what anybody on the call here does, but we want to fix things. We see a problem, we want to solve it. Same thing in research, like we see a problem, we want to answer it. But that approach is not appropriate if you're a non-Indigenous person working with Indigenous people. You have to put that aside and be ready to listen and learn and ask what you can do to help. And that's often uncomfortable because you might think you know the answer, but I will tell you now that you probably don't. And if you think you know the answer, you need to think a little bit harder. And there's a lot of sad, traumatic stories that come up in these discussions, and it's difficult to listen to. And there's a lot of, what's the word? Anger sometimes towards the non-Indigenous community for not understanding or for asking too much or for taking too much or whatever. And sometimes that gets taken out on me. I might not have done it personally at that time, but I'm there, and that makes me uncomfortable. But it always actually, if I can kind of bear that burden for a short time, it always helps develop relationships with those organizations and those communities. Because I do come back and I do continue to ask what I can do to help. And that relationship is the most important part of the work that I do. It takes a long time and a lot of time and a lot of effort. Creating space is very important, especially as an academic. Me and all my peers, we think we know everything most of the time, and we like to talk about it, and we like to talk about very little details or minute details. But when I attend an Indigenous event, like that's not the space for me to speak and to give my opinion. It's a space for me to listen. When I attend an event, say here at UMB, and there's Indigenous people there, then my job is to make sure that they have a voice and to help to make sure they have a voice, to help to make sure they get an opportunity to share, and that to help make sure that the people around the table are listening to that. And reconsidering best practice. So the university works in a certain way, the healthcare system, Horizon, the hospitals, whatever, they all work in a particular way. And when you're inside the system, it's hard to see like another way for something to happen. And so if I'm working with an Indigenous person or planning something and they tell me, I'd like to do it this way, and my immediate reaction is, no, we can't do it that way because, like, I have to be very careful to stop myself and say, okay, hold on, let's think about this for a minute. Maybe there is another way and I just can't see it right now. So one example is this picture. We're having a meeting with a research team of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We're outside, we're in a circle. And so circle is something that I try and use as much as possible because it really decreases power imbalances and puts everybody like on an equal footing, like at a meeting table, for example. But what happens sometimes, okay, like I want to book a meeting room and I want all the chairs put in a circle. And somebody might say, well, you can't do that. The room's a rectangle and there's all square desks. So that's, just because that's the way it's always been done, that doesn't mean that's the way it should be done. And we need to be able to think outside the box and like push what we're thinking a little bit. And then I need to like set my own priorities aside. So when I came to New Brunswick, I had just finished my my PhD in people's experience of mental illness in the Middle East. And I used grounded theory, and I created like a model or a theory. And so that's, you know, a great place for somebody on an academic career progression to start. You just develop this new idea. And, you know, typically what might happen is that you would take that theory and continue to develop it and test it and publish articles about it and things like that. But when I got here, I went to the Under One Sky Friendship Center in here in Fredericton, and I just wanted to go down and say hello and, you know, find out if there was anything that I could do to support them. So the first project that I worked on had absolutely nothing to do with my PhD or my master's research, or even didn't even really have all that much to do about research. So I had a nice conversation with the director down there, and one of the things that came up is she said, like I said, you know, what do you guys want to do? What might I be able to help with? And she said, well, we want to take our families camping. So we did this a couple of years in a row. It's like a land-based healing program that we have, but this year we don't have enough money for it. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I can apply for a research grant so that they can take their families camping. That was the primary aim of that grant. So that research project was all about building capacity in that organization to take their families out to promote their mental, physical, spiritual, emotional health. And the families, through the research, like I'm not going to talk about the outcomes, but they really got a lot out of it, and it had a high impact on their well-being, and it was something that most of them would not be able to access on their own. So although it seems kind of simple on the surface, it was actually quite impactful. And then within that project, this probably is the second time that I had started to incorporate Indigenous approaches to doing research. And I think we did fairly well. So one word that a lot of people here will be familiar with is a focus group. So instead of using a focus group, we used a slightly different approach, which is called a research circle. And so in Awitgati territory, a talking circle is a formal way to discuss important issues and to do conflict resolution and other things like that. And incorporate, there's a protocol towards how you would do a talking circle. And so a research circle is essentially a talking circle with a research focus. And so we started off with some food, some social conversation. We lit a smudge bowl and people use traditional medicines to smudge. And then we had an object that we passed around the circle, and whoever was holding the object, it's their turn to speak and everybody else listens. And it was interesting. We were there with everybody at the beginning and it was casual. And as soon as we started the protocol, it just completely changed the mood in the room and everybody was very focused. And we got some really rich data during those circles. And then something else we did, we published a paper after we finished this project, but that's not really helpful for the community members who are involved in this. And so we had an engagement session with them at the end of the project prior to finalizing the results to get their feedback, which is extremely important. You know, they had some really insightful feedback on what we were planning to present as the results. So we incorporated that, but they also wanted something that was accessible to them and not just a research article. And so we created an 8-page alternative format summary, with an infographic type approach and much simpler language and explanations. And that was very well received. So this is another project I worked on. So Aboriginal Head Start is a program funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada for off-reserve organizations and families. There's also an on-reserve program. And so the Friendship Center here has one, the Friendship Center in Halifax has one. And Public Health Agency does an evaluation of this program every 5 years. It's been running since I think 1998. It's one of the most successful Indigenous health promotion programs that I'm aware of, longest running. But the leaders at the Head Start programs weren't satisfied with the evaluations that have been done because they focused primarily on just the child, not just, but the child's educational outcomes. So educational success and grade scores and other things like that. And the program is so much more than, just preparing these young children aged 2 to 5 for further school. They really do a lot to come together to support the whole family and incorporate language and culture and traditions and things like that. And so they came to me and said, listen, we want you to do a better evaluation of these programs so that people can understand like what's really happening here. And so that's what I did. Like I sat down with them and they told me what outcomes I needed to look for that they were aware of, but also told me they wanted me to be open to unintended outcomes that they weren't thinking of or monitoring and measuring. The project was timely because right now the Public Health Agency is reevaluating how they do those evaluations. And so the directors of the Head Start programs here were able to take some of the results of the research to that team to kind of give them an example of the kind of evaluations that they were looking for and the kind of outcomes that they might expect. Right, and then respecting community engagement protocols is so important with this research and the relationship building. So I talked about the engagement session that we had at the end of the last project where they gave some feedback. So this one, because the project, the analysis got delayed and then COVID happened. And I have not been able to get the community members together to review the results in the paper and the alternate summary. So the paper's been sitting on my computer for 12 or 14 months, ready to submit to a journal. I would love to get it in there. And I'm sure my dean and whoever else reviews my academic progress would love for me to get it in there. But it wouldn't be appropriate for me to do that until I have that input and feedback and approval. And I might never get it. And that paper might sit on my computer forever and never get published. And then just one quick comment about the value of mixed methods. So this was primarily a qualitative project, but there was we didn't have the scope to look at the quantitative outcomes. But we've got a project going now to follow up on some of the qualitative stuff and look at the New Brunswick Institute for Research Data and Training at some linking data from the friendship centers with some of the administrative databases. And so, maybe you all know this already, but, the quantitative data is really important because it gives decision makers and funders it makes them, helps to convince them to say, yes, that something is worth funding. But the qualitative part and the stories are also really important because it makes them want to say yes. And so this is something that we're trying to build into most of our projects going forward. I just finished up an evaluation report. So this is another project with the Friendship Center here and is going to expand to the Family Resource Center in PEI as well. The staff over the years have had children with, a range of special needs, with behavioral challenges and autism and FASD and things like that. And they've got this really cool program where they take the kids outside for a lot of their learning. But they found that with those children who had the special needs, they didn't feel like equipped to be able to take them outside. And they ended up not being able to do that program too often. And so their director came to me and talked to me about that and kind of asked for my thoughts on how we might be able to address that. And around that same time, there was a funding opportunity from Employment Social Development Canada. And I was able to write a proposal and get the Friendship Center about $400,000 to develop capacity around bringing children with special needs outside. So it's neat. Like I never would have went to the Friendship Center and said, let's do a project about special needs, but they're coming to me, which makes the project community driven. And every step along the way, I said, is this the way you want to do it? And here's what I would suggest, but is this the way that you want to do it? And so there was a lot of input from the staff and from family members. And so then that evaluation provides evidence again of what they're doing and how they're growing at an organizational level, which actually helped them to get some more funding from the National Association without even applying for it because of the work that they have been doing to develop capacity. And there's a picture of a basket there. So when I started the evaluation, they had done one already with the same project manager that they hired for this project. And when I looked at it, like, I felt it was very Western. Like, I don't know what you know about evaluation, but there was a logic model, and there was, inputs and outputs and activities and outcomes, and used that before, and it's great, but it's a very like external evaluator coming in and collecting a bunch of stuff and then telling the organization if what they're doing is right or not right. And so I wanted to be really careful to make sure I wasn't being naive or like imposing my own non-Indigenous views or values or whatever into this evaluation as much as possible. And so we use basket weaving as like a metaphor for the evaluation. And we broke down like the objectives and outcomes into like strips and strands and sections of the basket when we talked about it. And instead of, looking at it as like a summative evaluation that happens at the end, we looked at the evaluation as like threading together the threads and the strands and strips of the basket. And with the acknowledgement at the very beginning that, the basket wasn't going to be perfect at the end. There'd probably be some areas where the basket was really strong and others where like some continued work would be needed. And it just turned out to be a really nice and like collaborative approach to this evaluation. And I think it really helped avoid the sense that somebody was coming in from the outside to evaluate them and tell them what they were doing was right or wrong or whatever. So I talked at the beginning about allyship being about not your priorities, but other people's priorities. So this is a picture of elders Chris Brooks and Charles Sewell, who do a lot of work around Fredericton and New Brunswick to support vulnerable community members. And they're standing in front of Chris's sweat lodge, which is a traditional healing and spiritual ceremonial space. And they're holding a check for, can't remember how much, for $300 and something thousand that I helped them to get to purchase a 62-acre piece of land on the Wostock River in Prince William, about 30 minutes outside of Fredericton. So I had worked with Chris a little bit. He's a great guy, and he shares a lot of his teachings with our students. And he's the chair of the board for Turning Leaf Foundation. And Turning Leaf right now supports at-risk youth, but they also do a lot of work supporting a lot of vulnerable people. And they were, their mentor was Elder Harry Laporte, who passed away a couple of years ago. But he had a program called Giveaway Wig, which I don't know what it means, but it was a transition house for Indigenous offenders who had come out of the prison system. So instead of spending their whole time in prison, they would go and live at Giveaway Wig and participate in ceremony and learn about culture and things like that. And it was really successful, but when he passed away, that initiative passed away with him. And so Chris and Chuck really want to get that on the go. I know nothing almost about the justice system here or about justice and restorative justice in general, but this is something that was really important to Chris and Chuck and to Turning Leaf. And so I said, okay, let's try and figure out what we can do. So it started off with that grant to get the piece of land through Reaching Homes. And I'm currently supporting one of their staff members to do a feasibility study about setting up a system of restorative justice where Indigenous people in some cases would be diverted from the provincial system into a community-based system. And I'm working on another proposal right now for Reaching Homes to kind of build the camp that they purchased a little bit, but also to do a more formal feasibility study about like what kind of building would be needed out there, how many rooms, what kind of operating model or business model, financial model would it use, like how would it how they get the income to support the staff that needed to be there. How should it be designed? So those are all things that, as a nursing professor, or as a, like I worked as a mental health nurse before this too, way outside of my comfort zone or wheelhouse or area of expertise. But my role is to help with stuff like this. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And by the end of it, I'm sure I'll know lots about the justice system, but at the moment, I'm not there yet. I've also got some great grad students working for me, and I've been able to support some of them with studentships through my research chair grant. So I have a PhD student where I don't have them. I'm supervising them. That's one thing too about working with Indigenous people and communities. Like there's a tendency to declare ownership of things like that, like my students or like my community partners, but they're not, they're not mine, and it's not right for me to use that language, but it's hard to get into the habit. So one student who's working on his PhD, he's really kind of dug into some of the program evaluation work that I'm doing. And so he's hoping to work with the Mi'kmaq Family Resource Center in PEI to do a similar evaluation to the one that I did for the special needs project here, but to hopefully do it better than I did. As a non-Indigenous person, I can't really indigenize something like that, but I could never be an expert in Indigenous evaluation because I'm not Indigenous, but that student is in a position to potentially do what I did, but do it a lot better. So I'm really excited about that. I've got another student. I'm supervising another student. So she's just about to submit her ethics, and she's going to be looking at the experiences of Indigenous women around perinatal care. So I imagine you'll probably be hearing about her research within Horizon. We're connected with a couple of people on that project. And so she wants to look at what traditional practices could be incorporated into perinatal care to make it like a more acceptable experience or service or services or whatever, wherever she gets to with it for Indigenous women, and to hopefully create something or co-create something that could improve perinatal outcomes for Indigenous women and children. Another student I'm supervising, amazing woman, Mi'kmaq woman. She's looking at cultural safety and wants to focus on emergency rooms, most likely. Some of you probably know who she is, Shelley Francis. She used to be the co-chair of the Indigenous Liaison Committee for Horizon. And I've got two new students that just started recently, one interested in recruitment and retention, and another one interested in allyship in the healthcare system. So you may also be hearing from them in a year or so. And then the last project I'm going to talk about, which is arguably the most exciting, also the most outside of my comfort zone and wheelhouse as a nursing professor, is plans to build a new friendship center for Fredericton that's really rooted in Indigenous philosophies and approaches to care and community. So you probably would have gotten the sense already that one of my main community partners is the Friendship Center here in Fredericton. And the, excuse me for a second. The executive director there, Mi'kmaq Elder Patsy McKinney, she's been saying to me since I knew her, I've always had a dream for an Indigenous healing center, not like a clinic, not a place where people come when they get sick, but a place where people could come to be well and to help them keep them on that path of being well. And about 6 months ago, I said, okay, it's probably time for me to stop nodding my head like a fool every time she says that and telling her how good of an idea it is, and start looking at and learning about infrastructure funding. And so we started to do that. And we had actually, early on, we connected with the Chalmers Foundation to discuss if there's any way they might be able to support something like this. And we spoke to the CEO and a couple of board members, and they were quite excited about the project. And through conversations with them, we said, okay, we need to do like a feasibility study to look at, like, what's the best site to have something like this in, like what land is available, how can you get it, how much is it going to cost to build it, what will it look like, et cetera, et cetera. So we thought that 10 months would be a reasonable timeline to get that done in. And then a week or two later, the federal government announced this green and inclusive community buildings program. So it's a $1.5 billion program for green and inclusive community buildings. And our 10-month feasibility timeline turned into a 2.5-month timeline. So I dropped everything that I was working on except for this. My program manager dropped everything. Somebody at the Friendship Center dropped everything, and one of our other community partners dropped everything. And we put our heads down and got to work. We talked to over 100 people, Indigenous leaders, business leaders, other community leaders, people from Horizon. We got from a drawing on a napkin to, I'll show you some more photos in a minute, to Class C designs in about a month or 5 weeks. And when we met with the curator of the Beaverbrook, who was also an architect, we told him, that we had just started whatever. And he said, oh, so you probably got some like half decent Class D designs. And we said, no, we're at a full Class C, which is architectural language that I've never heard of before. And he said, no, there's no way you could have gotten there. Like, your architect's lying to you. Let me see your photos or your designs. And we showed him, and he said, like, if I hadn't seen that, I never would have believed it was possible to get from there to here in that amount of time. So everybody was working hard because it's such an amazing idea and concept, and everybody really wanted to make it happen. The building, I'm just going to move this out of the way here. So the architects that we engaged at Fathom Studios from Halifax, they talked to elders in the region and Under One Sky staff and came up with this concept. Can you see you can probably see the hand here, hey? Yeah. So this is essentially the left half or the half of a turtle shell. So each of these pods represent the segments on top of a turtle shell, and the other half is just undeveloped land, but would be the other half of the turtle. One other neat thing, so there's a sacred fire and ceremonial space right here, and symmetry is really important or really prevalent in traditional Indigenous design. So every single one of these 7 pods are symmetrical down the center, and each line aligns perfectly with this central fireplace. And the architects said that they had never incorporated that kind of like Indigenous knowledge into their designs before, and it was really challenging. But they, you can see like the impact that it had on the designs. And so it's kind of like we started off thinking about a longhouse, but just due to space limitations, we had to be a little bit creative. So it's one fully enclosed building with different pods for different activities. So over here is an expanded early childhood education space for the Aboriginal Head Start program. This is a small clinic that's not a clinic. So there's a birthing suite in here. There's flexible office space for like a nurse practitioner or a counselor to work in, and an examination room. This is a 2-story administration space that's actually open to the rest of the building. So we didn't want to shut the staff off from the community. We wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same footing or equal level as much as possible. There's a activity room right here, so yoga, physiotherapy, etc. Boardroom, meeting space, cafe. The entrance, instead of having like a traditional like reception area and desk, is going to be set up like a living room with a fireplace and like grandmothers rocking babies and things like that. So a very warm, welcoming, loving kind of space. This is going to be a community kitchen. So if there's a community hunt and they bring home a deer or a moose or something, it can be processed and cooked here and shared at the dining table or outside. There's a lecture room here, so about a 25 capacity teaching space. And then this is one of I think the neatest parts. It's a traditional indoor-outdoor art and craft workshop. So you'll be able to build canoes here or do bead making or basket work. And then this is a flexible community gathering space where you could have a wedding or an event with a stage and things like that. And like, I'm not sure if anybody's thinking like, why is a nursing professor like working on something like this? Like, I can easily connect any single space or square footage in this building with health and well-being for Indigenous people. Like this early childhood education, the early years are critical, and connecting those kids with their culture and language is shown in the literature to have impact on their health outcomes. Having, health workers in a safe environment like this means that community members who are reluctant to go into the hospital or clinic for whatever reason can come somewhere where, it's all about them and their community to receive some of those services, etc. So it's a really, really exciting initiative for me anyway, and for everybody else who's worked on it. This is an outdoor rendering of the, so this is the outside of the gatherings, the event space. This is the outdoor workshop. That's the indoor workshop. And then that's the inside of the events hall. There's the Wolastoqey or Mi'kmaq 8-pointed star, or Wabanaki 8-pointed star, which form the basis for the roof design, the architecture. This is the director of the Friendship Center here. So they took her out of the photo and put her right into the designs. This is the language expert and her family. So yeah, really, really neat project. And we applied to the federal government for $18.6 million, which will cover 100% of the hard and soft costs. And then we'll just need to come up with some additional funding for fixtures and furniture and things like that. And say, oh yeah, we helped them. So right now, Under One Sky has like a bungalow on Union Street. And so last year we helped them buy a bungalow just behind them for some extra space. And at the beginning of this project, one of the critical steps was going to Minister Jill Green with infrastructure, because they owned like a sizable piece of land that was unused right next to the Friendship Center. And so they're in the process right now of transferring that to the Friendship Center. So they'll have enough space to build this entire complex. And that, I believe, is the end of what I wanted to say.